Today, we're talking all things vitamin D. We're going to cover how much vitamin D do we need, where can we get it, types of vitamin D, and advantages and disadvantages of each one, who needs to supplement vitamin D and who doesn't, should you test your blood levels of vitamin D or not, dangers, can you get too much vitamin D, other supplements that people often take together with vitamin D like calcium, vitamin K2, magnesium, and a lot more. So we got a lot of ground to cover. Let's get into it. Vitamin D is a vital molecule in our body, and it's a fascinating molecule. That sounds really nerdy to say. Hey, I am a nerd. And it's fascinating because it's both a nutrient that we can get from foods, and it's also a hormone that we produce in our body and plays all kinds of roles. It's important for bone health, for example. Vitamin D helps us absorb calcium in our intestine. But vitamin D is also important for our muscles and for nerve function and for our immune system and a number of other things. Okay, so how much vitamin D do we need to get per day? Well, most people need about 600 international units, a bit more for the elderly, 800 international units for people over 70, and a bit less for infants, 400 international units a day for children under 1 year old. Now, these are the reference numbers for the US. There's a little bit of variation between countries. So in the UK, for example, the number is 400 international units for adults, not 600. And then a little bit less for a child under 1 year old. So this gives you an idea of the ballpark. Now, sometimes these values are given in micrograms, and 1 microgram is 40 international units. Okay, so what happens if we can't get enough vitamin D? Well, some of the symptoms of insufficient vitamin D intake or vitamin D deficiency include fatigue, bone pain, muscle weakness, muscle aches or cramps, and also mood changes. In the elderly, lack of vitamin D can cause osteoporosis, and in children, it can affect growth patterns and cause rickets or osteomalacia. So these are all bone diseases or bone malformations due to lack of vitamin D. All right, great. So where do we get this vitamin D? How can we get it? There are 4 sources of vitamin D, and the first one is our body can make it itself. When ultraviolet light, and specifically UVB radiation from the sun hits our skin, we can make vitamin D, specifically vitamin D3, and we'll come back to what this means. So our skin takes a metabolite of cholesterol, a form of cholesterol, and makes vitamin D3 from that when it's exposed to ultraviolet radiation. That form of vitamin D is inactive. It's physiologically inactive. It then undergoes a couple of modifications, the first one in the liver, the second one in the kidney, that renders the actual active molecule, the active vitamin D, in the end. All right, so how much sunlight exposure are we talking in order to make all the vitamin D we need for a day? This obviously varies depending on your skin tone and how sunny the place is. But just to give you a general idea, in a sunny location with light skin, 5 to 15 minutes of sun exposure daily, or even just a couple times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, can be enough to cover our daily needs. And we don't need to be naked in the sun. Just exposure to the face, arms, and hands can be enough. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. If the sunlight comes through the window, it doesn't actually work because glass absorbs UVB radiation. So it needs to be direct exposure. Now, when it comes to ultraviolet radiation, this is going to be a trade-off, right? Because on the one hand, it allows you to make vitamin D in your skin. On the other hand, there's the risk of skin cancer. I know there's all kinds of stuff on the internet, people arguing that this is a myth, that the sun is natural, so it could never cause anything bad. This has no scientific substance. Ultraviolet radiation is carcinogenic. It is a risk factor for skin cancer. But of course, as always, this is going to depend on dose of exposure and individual susceptibility. So this is going to be a judgment call. It's going to be about personal strategy. I don't wear sunscreen every time I leave the house, but if I go to the beach or if I go on a hike to somewhere really sunny, right? Or sightseeing and I'm going to be in the sun for a couple hours, I do try to wear it. Your strategy might be different. You might be stricter than me or less strict, depending on skin type and the characteristics of the place you live. So it's good to know that sunscreen blocks UV, so it's going to protect your skin. It's also going to reduce the amount of vitamin D your skin produces. It doesn't go to zero. It doesn't eliminate it. It just reduces it, right? So people who wear sunscreen more often, they have to or they want to, might benefit from getting their vitamin D from other sources. In general, with sunlight, I would err on the side of caution, precisely because we have several other sources of vitamin D. So I would avoid sunburns, I would avoid excessive exposure to strong sunlight. Okay, so what are those other sources? Well, the second source are foods that naturally contain vitamin D. The most concentrated food source is fatty fish. So a piece of salmon or a piece of trout gets you most of the vitamin D you need for the day. Fish oil is also very high. Cod liver oil, for example, contains a boatload of vitamin D. Other animal products like beef liver, egg yolks also contain some, and mushrooms are also high in vitamin D, especially if they've been exposed to UV. Now, there's two main types of vitamin D, D2 and D3. Animal foods like fish or egg yolks contain D3, the D3 type, which is also known as cholecalciferol. And mushrooms, for example, contain mainly the D2 type, which is also called ergocalciferol. I know this is a lot of nerdy words for one video, but this way, when you see these words in a label, for example, you'll know what they're talking about. Cholecalciferol is D3, ergocalciferol is D2. Okay, so which one is better, D2 or D3? Well, we know they both get absorbed. We know they can both raise our blood levels of vitamin D, but D3 seems more potent. Cholecalciferol, the one that comes from animals, it's more potent. It raises blood levels more than D2. D3 might also have more biological activity. So for the same level in the blood, the D3 might be doing some things physiologically that D2 cannot do. Bottom line, I wouldn't rely on mushrooms exclusively for all of my vitamin D. And we'll come back to this question of D2 and D3 when we talk about supplements a little later in the video. All right, I said there are 4 sources of vitamin D. We've covered 2 of them, sunlight and foods that naturally contain vitamin D. The third source are foods that don't contain much vitamin D originally, naturally, but it's added to them during the production process. So this is what we call fortified foods. This includes things like cow milk, plant milks, some breakfast cereals, and orange juice, for example. These foods are often fortified with vitamin D. With all of them, you want to double check the specific brands you buy. Also with cow milk, bear in mind, the supplementation, the fortification depends on the country. In the US, it's usually fortified. In the UK, I believe it is not. So you definitely want to double check for your country and the specific brands you buy. Now, bear in mind, we talked about 2 types of vitamin D, D2 and D3, and the type that is found in fortified foods actually varies depending on the product. So cow milk, for example, and orange juice usually contain D3, the cholecalciferol. Plant milks usually contain D2, ergocalciferol. I don't know exactly why, if it's to be vegan, I don't know why that choice, but that's usually the norm. And they've tested the vitamin D from fortified foods, and it works the same as the vitamin D from foods that naturally contain it. So for the same amount and same type of vitamin D, they behave similarly, absorb the same, raise our blood levels of vitamin D the same. So that's good to know. And similarly, the food matrix, kind of what food you find it in, whether it's from fish or it's from eggs or from whatever else, doesn't seem to matter much, doesn't affect bioavailability. What does matter is the amount of vitamin D and the type that we talked about, but which food it comes from doesn't seem to be a big deal. So most healthy people can get all the vitamin D they need just from the sources we've covered so far. A diverse diet and some sunlight. Now, if you live somewhere where there isn't a lot of sunlight or you spend all your time indoors, then you might not get enough. And that's where our 4th source comes in, and that's supplements. Supplements are also really useful for people who have restricted diets, so lactose intolerance or allergies to fish and seafood, or people who are vegetarians or vegans. In those cases, either the fortified foods or the supplements are recommended. And supplements are also advised for people in specific groups. So children, for example, breast milk is not a reliable source of vitamin D, so children who are breastfed, it's recommended to give them a supplement. And these normally come in drops, and they contain multiple nutrients, and they usually contain vitamin D as well. So you're looking for 400 international units for a child under 1 year old, and then 600 international units above 1 year old. A little bit over is okay. It doesn't need to be exact, but you don't want to be way under or way over. We'll come back to this issue of too much vitamin D in a second. Now, for children that are not breastfed, they're usually on baby formula, and baby formula usually already contains vitamin D. I know in the US and in Europe, it's mandated by law. It has to contain vitamin D, but of course, double check for your country and your brand. Also, bear in mind, this is going to depend on the volume of formula that the baby drinks, right? If he or she is getting a very small amount of formula for some reason, it might not add up to enough vitamin D. So in those cases, you want to consider getting the supplement on the side. Above 1 year old, it's recommended to supplement with vitamin D for all children, all the way up to 18 years old. And that's because there's evidence for this age range that vitamin D supplementation improves bone health, so reduces the risk of rickets and osteomalacia and these things, and also seems to reduce respiratory infections for this population. And it's not even recommended to measure the levels of vitamin D of the child before starting the supplement. They just recommend what's called empiric supplementation. So just give the supplement to anyone under 18. And we'll come back to this question of the measurement of the blood level because this is really interesting. And this has been a bit of a paradigm shift in this field very recently. Okay, so that's children. And then the elderly, anyone over 75 years old, it's recommended to supplement with vitamin D as well. That's because with age, our skin loses some of its ability to produce vitamin D when exposed to sunlight. Also with age, people often go outside less. They're less exposed to sunlight. They also often start eating less and start eating less well. And so for all those reasons, supplementing with vitamin D is a good idea. And there's evidence in this population, this age range, that vitamin D supplementation can reduce mortality and reduce the risk of bone fractures, breaking bones. And also, it's not necessary to measure. Anyone over 75 has indication, empiric supplementation. And remember, the daily needs for the elderly are around 800 international units a day. So you're looking for a supplement around that range, maybe a little bit more for safety, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 international units, that ballpark. All right, so we covered children, we covered the elderly. Third group that has indication for vitamin D supplementation are pre-diabetics, specifically what they call high-risk pre-diabetics, which just means that they're a bit more stringent with the metrics. So high fasting glucose is not enough, but for example, high fasting glucose and high hemoglobin A1C, both elevated, both in the pre-diabetic range, would classify somebody as a high-risk pre-diabetic. So those people have an indication for vitamin D supplements because it's been shown to reduce the risk of progressing to full-blown diabetes. If you're pregnant, you also have automatic indication for vitamin D supplements. That's because in that population, it's been shown to help prevent a lot of issues that can happen in pregnancy, like preeclampsia, low birth weight, intrauterine death, just a lot of problems that can sometimes occur in pregnancies. Now, if you're breastfeeding, it's a bit more of a gray area. Some countries automatically recommend vitamin D supplementation for the mom during that stage. In the US, the latest vitamin D guidelines don't give breastfeeding moms an automatic indication, although often in that stage, moms are taking a multivitamin that usually includes vitamin D anyway. Other groups that have indication to supplement with vitamin D are people with specific conditions. Conditions, for example, that manifest with malabsorption, where you have difficulty absorbing nutrients from your gut. So things like celiac disease, cystic fibrosis, inflammatory bowel. Also people who have undergone certain surgeries like gastric bypass or surgeries where a part of the intestine is removed, and so it affects absorption. People with osteoporosis, people with hypocalcemia, very low levels of calcium in the blood. People with kidney diseases have indication as well. So these are all conditions that can affect the metabolism of vitamin D. Other than that, those groups we just covered, the latest guidelines don't recommend vitamin D supplementation for the population at large, for healthy adults, let's say. They're not saying you can't do it. They're not saying, please don't do it, you should not do it, it's dangerous. They're just saying there isn't very compelling evidence to tell everybody to go supplement. There's plenty of uncertainty, though. There's plenty of gray areas. And going over both these guidelines and a lot of the trials and a lot of the studies that the guidelines are based on, it's obvious that there's many areas where the level of certainty is not very high. There isn't a lot of work done for specific populations. And so these are things that might change in the future. It's possible. And the authors of all these studies and all these guidelines are very honest. They're very forthcoming with areas of uncertainty and levels of certainty and where it's low. For example, there's some trial data suggesting that vitamin D supplementation may reduce the risk of dying of cancer. Not the risk of getting cancer in the first place. We don't see much effect there, but a small reduction in the risk of dying of cancer. Plenty of limitations to those data as well. This is why they don't jump to saying everybody go take it. So this may or may not pan out in the future with more research. So you see how this is kind of a judgment call. It's a gray area. It's not black and white. And important to also point out that we don't see a lot of downsides. We don't see a lot of adverse effects of vitamin D supplementation at moderate doses, right? 1,000, 2,000 international units or less than that. So I think the more someone is really healthy and getting plenty of vitamin D from their diet or from their lifestyle, the weaker the argument to tell that person to go supplement vitamin D. But when in doubt, if someone has a condition that may affect their vitamin D metabolism, or if they're not sure if they're getting enough, they have some limitation or some constraint, I lean towards just supplement with a moderate dose because we don't see a lot of downsides. Okay, I keep saying moderate dose. Why am I harping on that? Because we can get too much vitamin D, and excess vitamin D is toxic. It can lead to hypercalcemia, so a level of calcium in the blood that's too high, and that can cause nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, pain, loss of appetite, dehydration, and kidney stones. In extreme cases, vitamin D toxicity can cause kidney failure, it can cause calcification of soft tissues, it can cause cardiac arrhythmias, it can even cause death if serious enough. Now, excess vitamin D pretty much always is going to come from mega dosing supplements. You can't get too much from the sun, your body regulates how much it produces in the skin, so that's not going to happen. It's also really hard to get massive amounts from the diet unless there's some crazy fad diet out there, like chugging bottles of cod liver oil or something like that. The internet never ceases to amaze us. So there is a specific value that they've set up as the maximum, what they call the tolerable upper intake value, and that's 4,000 international units a day. That's for adults. For children, the maximum is even less. You can see this table, under 8 years old, the maximum is lower, and then starting at 9 years old, at any adult age, the maximum is 4,000. And that's 4,000 total, right, from all sources combined. So from the sun, from your food, from your supplements. So the danger here is taking a very large amount from a supplement like 5,000 a day or 10,000 a day or even more consistently over time. If you take it once, it's whatever. But consistently taking that for an extended period of time, that's when it becomes a concern. So just be careful with content and influencers out there telling you to take massive doses daily for God knows what reason. There's even evidence that very high doses might be worse for bone density, maybe even for fractures, higher risk of fractures when taking a very high dose like 10,000 international units a day consistently over a long period of time. So it's not as simple as, oh, this nutrient is good, so let me just slam as much as I can, the more the merrier. Biology doesn't work that way. Now, in medicine, there's always an exception. So it's possible in some specific conditions that your doctor may want to prescribe a higher dose. If someone is really depleted and for a temporary period, you get a higher dose and then later you scale back down to maintain, that's possible. Or if someone has malabsorption and you're giving them a higher dose to try to trump that, okay, specific contexts, right? But in general, 1,000 international units, 2,000 international units a day is plenty. Okay, just to touch on price real quick, vitamin D supplements have become incredibly affordable. I got some vitamin D drops a while back, and it's good for a year. It's like a year's worth for one person, and it costs like €5, $5. They're worth about the same right now. So it's incredibly cheap, and you can probably find even cheaper on the internet. So I don't think the price is much of a factor right now. In fact, you can grab my discount code in the description and buy your vitamin D at 10% off and put some money in my pocket. Just kidding. I don't sell any supplements. I don't have a horse in this race. Okay, a little more information on supplements and the different forms you might find out there. You can often find vitamin D in multivitamins together with other nutrients. You can, of course, also find vitamin D sold by itself. So a supplement just with vitamin D. Now, some supplements are going to contain the D2 form and some are going to contain the D3 form. You remember we talked about this a minute ago. And like we said, they're both absorbed, they both work, but D3 seems to have a bit higher biological activity. So personally, I would just go with a supplement that contains D3. I haven't seen any downsides of D3 supplements, and most supplements nowadays contain D3 anyway. All right, where do they get these vitamins to put them in the supplements? The D3 usually comes from animal products like the wool of sheep. The D2 usually comes from fungi, so yeast or mushrooms. There is also a D3 supplement that is vegan, made from lichen or algae. So for people who prefer vegan supplements, just know that there is a D2 and a D3 form out there. They're all commercially available. Okay, so how should you take your vitamin D? This is really interesting because the advice you'll normally hear is that you should take the vitamin D supplement together with a meal that contains some fat, because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, so that's going to make absorption better. But when you look through the actual evidence, this is a little more complicated than that, because they've looked at higher fat and lower fat meals together with the vitamin D, and it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. There's some evidence out there suggesting that the type of fat might make a difference, maybe monounsaturated fats raising absorption a bit and polyunsaturated fats lowering it. This is extremely preliminary, and it might just be splitting hairs. I would just focus on getting enough vitamin D in whatever form you like and is sustainable for you. Whether you have it with or without some fat doesn't seem to be a big factor. In terms of presentation, there's vitamin D supplements in drops, in capsules, in tablets, in gummy bears, in sprays. Those are the main ones out there. Basically, they all work. There's one trial that compares the gummies to the tablets, and they find a little better bioavailability of the gummies. So if it's all the same to you, I guess go with the gummies over the tablets. We don't have trials comparing all of these presentations head to head. I'd say get whichever you like and are going to take regularly. Now, it's good to know that there's another form of vitamin D out there where the vitamin D is hydroxylated, and they call it calcifidiol. And it's more potent, it's better absorbed, and it bypasses that liver activation step we talked about. This requires a prescription. You can't get it over the counter. So for specific conditions where people have difficulty getting enough vitamin D from regular supplements, your doctor might prescribe this. So it's good to know it exists and what it is. Okay, what's the best frequency to take vitamin D supplements? A lot of people ask me this question. Is it better to take a smaller dose daily or a larger dose more sporadically, once a week or every once a month or something like that? The evidence we have points to the lower dose daily. We don't see any advantage of the large dose more sporadically, and there might be some harms. Maybe a higher risk of fractures for that higher dose more sporadically. Now, it's a small effect, and they only have trials for people over 50 for this comparison. So under 50, we don't really know. But if it's all the same to you, go with the lower dose taken daily. The bottom line from this whole section of the video about the 4 sources of vitamin D is they all work. Vitamin D from the sun, vitamin D from foods, from fortified foods, from supplements, they all work. So just make sure you get an adequate amount of vitamin D from whatever source you prefer. Okay, let's talk about measuring vitamin D level in the blood. You can absolutely measure it. It's a common test found everywhere, every lab. But the value of this measurement has really become shaky. We used to have these really exact cutoffs to categorize people into deficient or sufficient or insufficient in vitamin D, and this used to be a big deal. But these thresholds were defined based on indirect measures from observational studies. And randomized trials over the last few years have not confirmed these cutoffs. What these trials have generally shown is that whether people benefit from receiving the vitamin D supplement or not is not determined by their serum levels before they get the supplement, right? What we call the baseline levels. Even people with the lowest levels of vitamin D in their blood, we don't see a special benefit there. So these cutoffs have really been questioned in the latest guidelines, have really been de-emphasized. And this has been a bit of a revolution in this field because this used to be something kind of fundamental of how we thought about vitamin D levels. So it's not recommended anymore to screen for vitamin D levels in most people because it doesn't guide the decision. They just recommend the empiric supplementation in those groups that we talked about, regardless of their blood level. Now, if you have a specific condition, maybe your doctor still wants to measure your vitamin D levels. If you have a GI condition or something like that that affects vitamin D metabolism, but for the population in general, to screen for vitamin D levels, it's no longer recommended because the evidence to support it is not strong. Okay, there's a couple of gray areas, specific populations that I want to touch on. So people with darker skin, melanin reduces vitamin D production in our skin. So in general, blacks and Latinos tend to have lower vitamin D levels. But this is a little bit of a conundrum because when you look at actual outcomes, like risk of fractures, for example, they're not worse in these populations. Also, when you look at trials, when they get a supplement, you don't see an extra benefit. Very similar for obese people, they also tend to have lower levels of vitamin D, and that's because fat tissue can sequester vitamin D, so there's less left for other tissues. But similarly, you don't see worse outcomes like fractures in that population, and also when you supplement, you don't see an extra benefit. So these are current puzzles. We don't know exactly what's going on there, and it's another argument that the level of vitamin D in the blood is kind of a very iffy metric by itself. It doesn't tell us that much, right? But so currently for these populations, it is not recommended to supplement vitamin D by default, although there isn't that much data specifically looking at these populations. So it's possible that this will change in the future. Here's something else to look out for. Vitamin D supplements, vitamin D pills, will often be hawked on social media with this type of pitch. Hey, people with low vitamin D have higher risk of this disease, of heart disease. So buy my pills in my online store and dodge a heart attack. This is not a compelling argument because vitamin D often drops as a result of disease, as a result of sickness. And people with less outdoors activity also have lower vitamin D. So people who just spend more time indoors. So low vitamin D associates with all kinds of diseases, with cardiovascular disease, with depression, with multiple sclerosis, with obesity. But all of these have basically flopped in randomized trials. So giving people vitamin D pills didn't do anything for these conditions. So low vitamin D is often an innocent bystander, not the cause of a lot of these problems. And so popping a pill doesn't do anything. So what you want to see is a trial where the participants receive a vitamin D supplement and they experience an improvement in the condition that's being studied. Now that's a completely different level of evidence, right? It's very much harder to show that. So just keep your eyes peeled for that switcheroo that we often see on social media. Don't get me wrong. It's not like vitamin D doesn't do anything. It's all myths. We've already looked at a number of benefits that have been demonstrated in trials. And here's another one. Inflammatory bowel disease. Vitamin D supplementation in randomized trials reduces relapse, reduces episodes. So yeah, for some conditions it pans out and for others it doesn't. And we have to test. All right, we're getting close to the end here. I want to spend a minute talking about what was the number one question people asked me. And that's these other supplements that people sometimes take with vitamin D. So the question was, if I take a vitamin D supplement, do I also need to be taking calcium or vitamin K2 or magnesium? The short answer is no. Most people don't. So I'll make videos specifically about each one of these. We'll go into the data in more detail. But basically, calcium supplements make sense for specific situations. If you're at risk of osteoporosis, for example, or you can't get enough calcium from your food for some reason, then supplementing makes sense. So it's not everyone that's taking a vitamin D. With vitamin K2, the main question has to do with calcifications. So people ask, does taking a vitamin D supplement cause calcifications of the arteries or the heart valves? And does taking a vitamin K2 at the same time prevent that? And physiologically, this question makes sense because vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium in the gut. So all that calcium floating around has to go somewhere. Maybe some of it will end up lodged in the artery wall or a heart valve or something like that. So I've seen some reports of calcification with extreme doses of vitamin D, like 25,000 units every day. But with moderate doses, trials don't really show increased calcification. Even with high doses, like 10,000 international units a day, we don't see it. And more importantly, cardiovascular outcomes are not worse with vitamin D supplements. So yeah, maybe with vitamin D toxicity, extremely high levels, with hypercalcemia, maybe calcifications become an issue. But with the moderate, reasonable doses we've been talking about, doesn't seem to be a big concern. It's also not clear that reducing calcification with vitamin K2 would be a good thing in the first place. Maybe it reduces risk of heart attacks. Maybe it increases it if it makes black more unstable, for example. We have a whole video on this. The bottom line is the trials we have so far don't show much of an effect of vitamin K2 on cardiovascular outcomes, heart attacks, and strokes. Now, there's other ongoing trials, so maybe this will change in the future. But right now, there isn't very compelling evidence to take vitamin K2 for heart health. Now, K2 for bone health, we have more interesting data there. Specific population, postmenopausal women with osteoporosis, K2 probably helps increase bone density. We have several trials showing that. Although, when we look at the actual outcome data for fractures, for risk of fractures, it's a lot less clear. It's kind of mixed. So I would say the data for K2 and bone health is a maybe. Now, we don't see a lot of serious adverse events with vitamin K2 in trials, so it seems pretty safe to take a K2 supplement. So if someone wants to do it on the off chance, I wouldn't try to talk them out of it. Just be aware that there isn't very strong evidence supporting it, right? Not very strong evidence of benefit. So it might do nothing. And then magnesium, it's a similar story. There's some interesting data on blood markers of bone metabolism, but when we look at actual outcomes, bone fractures, heart attacks, cardiovascular outcomes, we don't have a lot of compelling outcome data. Now, just like the K2, supplementing with magnesium seems pretty safe, at least at moderate doses. So if someone feels strongly about it, it's probably not a big deal. It's probably not dangerous. But is there a strong scientific argument that everyone on vitamin D needs to be taking magnesium supplements? I don't see it. Plus, magnesium is in lots of foods. So in general, a well-designed, healthy diet should cover magnesium needs. But we'll definitely do a deeper dive into all this in the magnesium video. The bottom line here is that a lot of people have indication for a vitamin D supplement and not for one of these three. So it's not the case that you have to be on these if you're on vitamin D. And the main takeaway here, guys, the message I want you to go away with is how these things are sold to you on social media, right? Storytelling versus compelling scientific evidence. My goal here is not to tell you what to do, it's just to give you these tools. What is compelling scientific evidence? What is a compelling argument and what's not? And then you're going to take all of this information and make your own educated decisions. Okay, what about kidney stones? Do vitamin D supplements cause kidney stones? We do see a small increase in kidney stones with combined vitamin D and calcium supplements, but not with vitamin D alone, even with high doses, which is another reason calcium is not automatically given with vitamin D unless there's a specific indication for calcium and the benefit outweighs the risk. I also looked at the effect of vitamin D on COVID, and the data is a little mixed, but some interesting trials there suggesting some benefit. For example, some reduction in mortality for COVID patients given multiple administrations of vitamin D. Last thing to bear in mind, vitamin D can interact with some prescription meds. Statins, steroids, diuretics are some examples. So talk to your doctor before you start a vitamin D supplement if you're on any prescription drugs. To summarize everything we talked about, and we covered a lot, 3 main takeaways from this video. 1, make sure you get an adequate amount of vitamin D from whatever source you prefer. For a lot of people, diverse diet with some sunlight can get you all the vitamin D you need. If that's not a possibility for some reason, some restriction, some constraint, consider the Fortified Foods or a supplement. For children, for the elderly, pre-diabetic, pregnant, or people with specific conditions, supplements are indicated. Takeaway number 2, yes, it is possible to get too much vitamin D, and pretty much every time this is going to happen from supplements. So be careful with excessive vitamin D doses over time. And takeaway number 3, measuring blood levels of vitamin D most of the time for most people is not needed. And those specific cutoffs that we used to have, the deficient and the sufficient, have come into question. Here's that previous video on vitamin K2 with a lot more information. And here's everything you need to know about vitamin B12. Check those out. I'll meet you in there. Bye-bye.